Hello, and welcome again to the virtual companion series for the African Methodist Episcopal Church, A History by Dr. Dennis C. Dickerson. Today we're going to be discussing Chapter 3, Welcome to the Ransomed. So let me begin by introducing our dynamic panel. First, we have Dr. Carrie Banton. She is an Associate Professor of History and African American Studies in the J. William Fulbright College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Arkansas. Welcome, Carrie. Secondly, we have Dr. Reginald Hildebrand. He is a retired professor of African American Studies and History at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and he is a member of St. Paul AME Church in Chapel Hill. Welcome.
Very glad to be here.
Next, we have Dr. Tanja Dandy. She is the principal of the Tennessee School for the Blind and director of Christian education at Greater Bethel AME Church in Nashville. Welcome.
Thank you for being here.
And finally, we have Reverend Terrence L. Thomas, who is the pastor of Bethel AME Church in Champaign, Illinois. Welcome.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
So we are so pleased to have all of you with us today. We're very excited about this chapter. So I'll begin with an opening question that is really towards all of you. But first, we'll go to Terrence. So how did this chapter inform your understanding of AME Church history? And what did you learn that you didn't know already? So we'll go to Terrence first, and then we'll go around.
In terms of what did I know, I'm laughing because all these African American studies scholars, and I've been itching to get my PhD in African American studies. So in an overall sense, it wasn't anything I didn't know. What I've come to realize, though, is how integrated AME history is in African American studies, right? You can argue that AME history is African American studies. And so the weaving, so like Hiram Revels, AMEs at Fort Pillow, things like that, kind of like made me raise an eyebrow and say, okay, so throughout history, I know as a preacher, we often get up and say, you know, AME history, we're everywhere. And then to really find out that, no, we're really everywhere. It was eye-opening. It was I guess a moment of pride, if you will. Like, yeah, this thing is dope. So
we were there. We did that.
Yeah, it's because these are all the names, like, if at least when I was coming up, these are names you learned about: Reconstruction, Civil War, like they were on the wall. But then to find out they share denominational, you share articles of faith, like there's a kindred brotherhood. It's almost like, I don't know, when you're in your fraternity, I'm a Sigma, and you find out like Huey P. Newton's a Sigma. That makes it even more like, oh my God. So that was kind of my reaction, like in terms of knowledge base. I knew a lot of this, but how it connected to the church, that's where the awakening happened.
Wonderful. And Carrie, what about you? Same question.
Yes, I would say the same as Reverend Thomas, that as a professor of African American Studies, this is basically the outline, right? Especially when you get to the Civil War, you're teaching about Hiram Revels and African American movement out of the Civil War and Reconstruction and, you know, rights, but then learning all about the role of the church as an institution, as a builder, as efforts to secure African-American education. That certainly was also was enlightening. But for me, the most interesting piece was I didn't know that the BME had separated from the AME. I had known about African Americans, of course, as fugitives going across into Canada and, you know, claiming British subjecthood in order to get that protection. But to enshrine that within an organization was certainly fascinating. And to see that coming back together again when the AME and the BME reunited, that was the most fascinating part.
Well, that's great. Okay, Reggie, how about you? Can you unmute?
Yeah, you knew the old guy was going to do that. I agree with what has already been said, and I just starting off, just saying how overwhelmed and impressed I am with this project by all the Dickersons. That someone of my vintage would probably want to hold a conference and maybe reach 100 or 200 people, and that would be the end of it, even if we could have it during the virus. But this concept is an extraordinarily effective and appropriate way for launching a book of the significance of Dr. Dickerson's book. What it has informed me about AME history and what that I've learned that was new. I think Dennis Jr. In citing the very title of the chapter, "Welcome to the Ramson," that being the title of that sermon by Bishop Payne at Ebenezer in Washington in April of 1862, underscores the theme of the book and of this chapter about people reaching out, and the church reaching out to 4 million people coming out of slavery and fusing together the idea of freedom from slavery and racial oppression and freedom and redemption from sin and shortcomings. In terms of what I learned that was new, of course, I always knew about how meticulous and rigorous Dr. Dickerson Sr. is in his research. But even so, as I went through this book and as a whole and through this chapter, I was just overwhelmed by the number of sources and documents and obscure annual conference records and general conference records and references to articles in obscure journals and references to articles that Dr. Dickerson had in fact commissioned when he was editor of the AME Review. It was just very, very impressive piece of work and scholarship, really the fruit of a lifetime of work and study. There were two things that were absolutely new to me that I'm embarrassed to admit were absolutely new to me. One was I did not know that there had been a split from the South Carolina Conference called the Reform Union Methodist Episcopal Church. I had not heard of that before I read this chapter, nor did I know that in 1880, the General Conference suggested that there should be outreach to the Chinese community in California. That was entirely new to me.
Casting a wide net. We casted a wide net. Okay, well, before we get to Tanja, I just want to say welcome to a few of our audience members. So welcome Daniel, Prudence, Elmira, and Alvin. Thank you so much for watching. So Tanja, same question.
I think, well, after reading the chapter, one of the things that I realized was, how intricate and detail-oriented the AME Church has been for a very long time. We know that from our discipline, but to see the intricate details and as Reginald mentioned, the intricacies and the meticulousness, of the work that was done, that was not only gratifying for me to read about, but it was very inspirational. And I would also add that, what I did not know when I read the chapter, I had no idea about a lady named Bridget Biddy Mason and about the Westward movement. Being a young scholar and in my early years when we studied the Civil War, we heard about, Western expansion, but I just don't think it was shared with me and my classmates that, the importance and the fortitude that African Americans had to have to be able to, expand and to move westward. I didn't know that. I certainly didn't know about Nicodemus, Kansas. I just didn't know that because that's not something that's really shared readily, I think, in history books, even currently, as an educator and as a principal, I look at the history books and I went and looked for the information. I just don't see it there. So, this kind of what it's done for me is it's opened my eyes even more, about how important it is for us to tell our story. If things are not written down as the way your father, Dr. Dennis C. Dickerson Sr. has written it, then we won't know our history. And so I just appreciate the detail, the research, the lifelong love of history, and the lifelong love of our people that he presented in this book and in this work. So that's what I learned.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad you made those comments as well, because oftentimes we'll see a date. You know, the AME Church in South Carolina started on this date. It started in Ohio this date. It started in California this date. But we don't really think about what that means. That means in the 1850s, Black people were out there and they were facing that and they were able to do that. So when you really unpack, you know, what those dates mean, when you just see that list of this annual conference was founded here, this annual conference was founded this year, when you really sort of peel back the layers and think about what that means, it really is quite remarkable. So we're actually going to stay with you, Tanja, for this next question. So the author makes great mention of the Christian Recorder in this chapter, and the Christian Recorder is certainly a source that he uses throughout. And so could you speak to what role did the Christian Recorder play in African American life during the period of this chapter?
So, okay, that's a great question, and thank you for letting me lead this question. One of the things that I truly believe in as we study history, it's very important while we study history, we need to make it relevant to our current society. So I start by saying that to me, as I read about and learned more about the Christian Recorder, I would say that the Christian Recorder was the Facebook or Twitter of that time. That's what I would say. And so it also served as a publication that African American people, free and ones that, you know, we were just emancipated, that was a source that we could go to for information, because that's all we had. And it's very important when you are working with persons, and I imagine during this day, you know, persons just freed, you don't really know what freedom is like because you've always been told what to do, how to live, what you couldn't do. It was important to have a source that you could go to get information, but to also be inspired. Because in order for you to progress as a people and to be able to persist and pursue liberation and all with what that means, you have to be inspired to do so. So that publication, to me, it focused on religion, morality, science, and literature. But one of the auspices of the source was that it was the publication was also meant to be treated through all geographic areas of the AME Church.
Yes.
And so that is one of the main things. There was to be equality and information for all. Also, articles in the Christian Recorder talked about voting rights, equality, classism, racism. It addressed issues of the Black family and how you should live. It talked about morality and things like that. So I think that without the Christian Recorder, Black folk would not have had a source that they could go to where they could count on information at that time. So it definitely served as, you know, a source of information, the Twitter and Facebook of that day.
Absolutely. So I'm going to see if anyone else has anything to say about that. But first, let me acknowledge a few more of our audience members. Hello, my friend from Williamstown, Massachusetts, Alexa, and our other friends and viewers like Reverend Orcella, who was a panelist on our first broadcast. All right, so does anyone else have a comment about the Christian Recorder and the role it played in African American life? Anything to add to Tanja's wonderful commentary?
I would add that was exactly what I thought, Tanja, when I saw it. That was Black Twitter back in the day. It around that time, you know, beginning with Freedom's Journal and Colored American and that the cadre of Black newspaper that circulated around that time served very significant purposes, very much like Black Twitter serves now in terms of being the corrective, right? Narrating African-American presence into a society that was determined to create a narrative about African-American people and African-American life in ways that was meant to damage and demean them. So that important narration that these Black newspapers were doing, the ways in which they staged debates about critical issues from immigration migration, ideas about leadership and morality and all the things that you mentioned, Tanja, was certainly very important. So the Christian Recorder and by being a part of that voice, Chinua Achebe says, until lions have their own historians, the hunt will glorify the hunter. And so we got our historians, and that was the Christian Recorder narrating Black life into American society.
Okay, go ahead.
I'd just like to endorse and affirm the very thoughtful comments that Dr. Banton and Dr. Dandy made about the significance of this. I agree with everything they said. I wish I could have said it as well. Think about the audacity of the masthead that Dr. Dandy talked about. It says that published by the African Methodist Episcopal Church in the United States for the dissemination of religion, morality, literature, and science. And it lived up to that. And at a time when most Black people, it was illegal for them to know how to read or write, they recognized that they had to do a little more and to extol that and to provide people information they could get nowhere else. And as has been already pointed out, this was, I think, the only nationally distributed newspaper wherever Black people were. Even though it was published in Philadelphia, it wasn't a Philadelphia newspaper. Right. And even though it was published by the AME Church, a lot of other people read it for the reasons that Dr. Banton was talking about, that if you wanted to know what the Black perspectives, plural, were on the issues of the day, you read the Christian Recorder. You read letters from chaplains and soldiers and preachers and lay people. Yes. You read poetry by Frances Ellen Watkins Harper or short stories from her. And if you get a chance to look at, and it's available online now, some of the issues from the 1860s, you will be very impressed by the quality of the writing and the editing. And I think that the current editor, John Thomas III, who I think I saw come on here not long ago, has been inspired by that heritage and is attempting in many interesting and innovative ways to recover that legacy on digitally and online, and with the dialogues with people about different issues. He is restoring what the Christian Recorder what once represented for Black people.
Absolutely. And Terrence, do you have any comment on that as well?
Not to be redundant, I love the Twitter and Facebook analogy. And I also think it needs to be really lifted up the longevity, right?
Yes,
Dr. dropped Freeman's Journal. That lasted 2 years. William Lloyd Garrison's paper, dissolved in 1866, Frederick Douglass is the North Star. And in terms of being the premier paper for Black America, the Christian Recorder is still, it's all we really have. There's no more gender. Ebony's all but gone. Jet is gone. I don't know if the Sentinel out of LA is gone. So this is, it actually increases sort of a responsibility, if you will, if there's a spiritual challenge in the charge to lift the Christian Recorder to that standard again, right? You're the last one. I think the other one is the final call. And so that's probably a conversation why the two religious newspapers have survived.
Have endured.
But I think that really needs to be said. Like it wasn't the first, but it's the last one standing. With the exception of the final call, it's the last one standing. And so I love the Facebook and Twitter, because even when you look at the articles, there was argument. I'm an avowed Black nationalist. I don't hide it. So the Christian Recorder was for Black people, Black people, right? It wasn't written by white abolitionists. It didn't have to cater. And so I think that's what makes the history of it absolutely beautiful.
This was a wonderful discussion about the Christian Recorder. I, in my own research, am constantly surprised, impressed, grateful for the information in the Recorder, for the research I do, looking at early Oklahoma. There is no other comparison. There's nowhere else for me to get the kind of materials that I get from the Christian Recorder. There is nothing else. It is the newspaper of record for African Americans for the 19th century. It simply is. So we have a question from the audience from Alvin T. Riley I'm sorry. Oh, yes, from Joan B. Garrett. The question is, do you think the Christian Recorder could be included as part of the church school curriculum? I will direct that to whoever would like to take that.
I'm happy to respond.
Yeah, since you do Christian education, yeah.
Of course. I think that it would be beneficial if we have not included it in our church school curriculum, that we should, not only for the historical impact, but also because what it will do, it will show our constituency, our stakeholders, about the importance of publication, about the importance of writing and presenting factual information. It will also encourage us to remain true to our understanding of historical facts, how to do research, and things like that. And I think we can all benefit from that level of understanding. And I continue to refer to, as an educator, many of our students, that we serve, sometimes lack the understanding about, what is considered to be a primary source versus a secondary source, and just understanding, how to cite resources and things like that. So if persons can learn and understand the fact that we as African American people, we've been publishing for a long time, I think that will inspire courage. It will inspire us to get out of our comfort zones, and it will also inspire us to help persons behind us, perhaps persons younger than us, to understand that it's important to understand the rules of literacy, how to read, how to write, because you need to be able to express yourself in order for you to be heard.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right.
Christine?
Yes, go ahead, Cree.
I was going to say, that drags my mind back to when we used to do the Keeping Our History Alive at Greater Bethel.
Right.
So that's an important avenue that, the younger people could connect using the Christian Recorder.
Oh, good memories. Okay. So this next question I'm going to direct to Reg, because it involves where in the chapter Dr. Dickerson cites you. So on page 110, for those of you who have your books with you, the author quotes Reginald Hildebrand as saying that emancipation, quote, destroyed an old world and brought a new experience. It, meaning the AME Church, was an independent Black denomination established on the grand basis of Christian manhood and independence. So what specifically equipped the AME Church to, quote, undo the damage done by slavery and combat ongoing racial oppression? So what enabled the AME Church to be that for African Americans?
I think I know what Hildebrand was getting at there. And let me go at it this way. There is ways of understanding freedom, and the way freedom is secured, facilitated, and encouraged and strengthened. But in understanding freedom, you tend to think about politics and economics and social development and other kinds of things, all of which are very important. There's also another dimension, something that happens to an individual's spirit when they go from being property to being something other than property. And that's kind of that had to be addressed in some way. Dr. Du Bois, if you indulge me, did try to get at that in Black Reconstruction when he wrote about the religious dimension in one very moving passage where he says, foolish talk, all of this you say, and that is because no Americans now believe in their religion. Its facts are mere symbolism, its revelation, vague generalities, its ethics a matter of carefully balanced gain. But to most of the 4 million Black folk emancipated by Civil War, God was real. They knew him. They had met him personally in many a wild orgy or religious frenzy or in the dark stillness of the night. His plan for them was clear. They were to suffer and be degraded, and then, by divine edict, raised to manhood and power. And so on January 1, 1863, he made them free. The magnificent trumpet tones of Hebrew scripture, transmuted and oddly changed, became a strange new gospel. All that was beauty, all that was love, all that was truth stood on top of those mad mornings and sang with the stars. A great human sob shrieked in the wind and tossed its tears upon the sea. Free, free, free. Now that's what I was trying to say. Dr. Du Bois, Dr. Du Bois nailed it, and that's part of what we, in addition to the other analysis that we're doing, that's part of how this was experienced spiritually, theologically. And the AME Church was suited for this because it was a vessel that contained and modeled and facilitated and encouraged Black possibilities and potential and hopes. And the spires of AME churches were beacons of freedom, which drew people and inspired people and showed them the way forward. So with acknowledging Dr. Du Bois, that's the answer to the question from my point of view.
Absolutely. Okay. Can everyone still hear me? Okay, because I was having a little trouble with my earphones. Okay, so that is an amazing answer, and I certainly enjoyed seeing your perspective from the times were strange and stirring in the book, because I've obviously read your book before and I used it in my own research, so it was great hearing about that. So to Carrie, how did 19th century Black people view President Lincoln? And to what extent have we reevaluated his legacy? So we're kind of in this moment where we are rethinking, reevaluating all of our, heroes and national leaders. So how did 19th century Black people view Lincoln? And to what extent have we reevaluated that legacy?
That's a great question, Christina, and so timely, right? As you said, we're in the throes of rebellion right now, uprising, where rightfully Black people are questioning, all of these people who have been held up to us as liberators and emancipators, certainly coming from the Caribbean. For us, it was Wilberforce, Wilberforce,
Yeah.
Lincoln freed the certainly African Americans felt some level of gratitude, as Dr. Hildebrand expressed before. They felt a greater gratitude to God that he was moving through Lincoln as a vessel. But they certainly felt a certain degree of gratitude when he was, moving from, the Confiscation Acts into the Emancipation Proclamation. And they certainly felt some sadness and grief. Certain churches set out to grieve for 6 months after he was shot, right? But now that we are in this moment of uprising, we know now that they have people like me in the academy we're like, no. Now that we have African Americans who are writing histories from the perspective of those people on the ground. What did, the soldiers do? What did the people who were preparing food? What is their perspective? Instead of elevating, as we've often done, the narratives of great white men, right? So now we're seeing all of that is being questioned, and we're seeing that it was, in fact, African Americans who put emancipation on the ballot, who voted with their feet, who ran away into camps and forced Union generals to push for the Confiscation Acts, because clearly it would not make sense to send your enslaved people back to the Confederacy so that they.
Corey, could you actually explain really quickly what the Confiscation Acts are, just for people in the audience who may not know?
Right. So there was Confiscation Acts 1 and 2, which was passed after enslaved African Americans started running away to Union lines, because African Americans interpreted the war as a war for their freedom, even as Abraham Lincoln was trying to keep the Union together and saying it was for the unification of the United States. They thought the war was for their liberation, and so that's what prompted them to run to Union lines. And in running to Union lines, it forced, what are we going to do with these what are we going to do with these enslaved Africans? So we saw the passing of the Confiscation Act, number one, in 1861, that enabled Union generals to take as contraband, right, the property of the Confederacy, right, and to hold it, and that snowballed into what eventually became the Emancipation Proclamation. So it was, in fact, African Americans, by voting with their feet, by running away, that moved Lincoln, that pushed him towards a greater thrust of emancipation for African Americans. African Americans did that.
Absolutely. Does anyone else have anything to add about that? How did 19th century Black people view Lincoln, and to what extent have we reevaluated his legacy? Does anyone else have any comment on that? I had a feeling you would.
Dr. Banton, actually, I loved her the way she summarized that, because a couple of years ago, maybe about, I want to say 10, 15 years ago, Dr. Lerone Bennett wrote an excellent book called Forced into Glory that really unpacked Lincoln's legacy and how we view him. It's funny Dr. Banton, brought up the Confiscation Acts, because these were general-led initiatives. These were generals openly defying Lincoln's don't touch policy and moving him towards emancipation. That was never his goal. And I think now we have a healthier view. Like, I don't want to discredit the ancestors and elders the way they saw him. They saw him the way they saw him in that context. But now it is healthy for us to say, listen, this was a guy that played political chess with the lives of Black people. His own words, if I could do this without freeing a slave, I would. His concern was to stop the expansion of slavery, not the abolishment of slavery. That was kind of like and in fact, only agreed to it, I would even argue, from foreign pressure from Britain and France to keep them out of the war. And so I think it's healthy, with the exception of Hamilton. Please don't touch Hamilton. Do not disrupt my joy. I think that it's important to reevaluate characters like Lincoln and show that these were real men who were problematic, and it's okay, to say that. It doesn't diminish the fact. When you consider his predecessor, Buchanan, sat on his hands and did nothing to stop the Confederacy rising. You can say Lincoln, okay, we appreciate that, but we also can say that he was willing to, after all that bloodshed, all that trauma, to just forgive and forget and let the Southerners come back. And it was his generals in Congress that, would later say, nah, that's not how this works.
Okay. All right. Anyone else have anything to say about that? Yes.
Yeah, one of the joys and challenges on being on a panel of this quality is it doesn't leave a whole lot to be said after thoughtful people go at these questions. But going back to the view of Lincoln in the 19th century, or as we got into this, Dr. Dickerson pointed out in the chapter that St. Paul AME Church in Raleigh, North Carolina, was the site of the first, or at least one of the first, I think the first, Colored People's Convention in the South in September of 1865. And that church, it's still on the same site, of course, not the same building, was known at the time as the Lincoln Church, because they had in the sanctuary a bust of Lincoln, who had been assassinated just a few months before. So for the people coming out of slavery, when with all of the limitations and complications, and they weren't particularly, I don't think, naive about that. You can read things that Henry McNeil Turner and others said. With all of that, when the proclamation was issued, Lincoln became an honored and revered person because no one had done that before.
Right.
And after his assassination, he approached something like sainthood in terms of how people regarded him. And the Emancipation Proclamation, which has a great many problems, was regarded almost as a sacred text. Barbara Fields, who was quoted in the documentary on the Civil War, I think began the discussion about who freed the slaves, and made many of the points that Dr. Banton made so well about the role of people coming out of slavery, forcing the issue, making it an issue, making it impossible to be ignored. And as Reverend Thomas pointed out, in changing the popular view, a great deal of credit has to be given to Lerone Bennett, both for an article he wrote in 1968 in Ebony called Was Lincoln a White Supremacist? And the book that Reverend Thomas mentioned, published in 2000, which he just says pretty exactly what Reverend Thomas said. My own view was that what we in empowering and affirming the role that Black people played in this is important. Those are the contributions that have been made by Fields and Bennett and others. And putting Lincoln in perspective is absolutely necessary if we're going to get that history straight. I don't think it requires, however, dismissing Lincoln altogether with all of his flaws. Another person in the White House might not have done even what he did.
Absolutely. Tanja, do you have anything to say about that, or?
No, I support everything that's already been said, and I agree.
Okay.
Well,
All right. All right. So, Terrence, we're going to kick it back to you. What contributions did AMEs make to the Union Army and in general to Black troops? So we obviously all know what the Civil War is, and we know what basically happened. But what specific contributions did AMEs make to the Union Army and to Black troops in general?
In very simpler terms, land and bodies. Oftentimes if I can have a nerd moment, the Civil War, as the scholars on this panel know, is painted as this noble cause by the North, in which the North galvanized around and immediately went to war for the South. But that wasn't the case. I mean, you can just look at the New York draft riots to prove that, folks in the North wasn't feeling this war.
We're into it.
Lincoln had to fire generals because they wouldn't fight the way he wanted him to fight. And so here you have this denomination, this body of Black folks that's giving up church space to recruit, to train troops, leading the recruitment effort, putting on the ground for Black folks to be able to fight. And so the AME Church, in a sense, centers the Black movement, at least how I experience and interpret it, centers the movement in the African-American community to buttress the war effort that was greatly needed in the North. Up until, I think it was Antietam, the war wasn't going well for the North. And a large part of that was recruits, a large part of that was strategy. And so the church helps, it's almost like a pillar. And so in simplest terms, they gave resources, human resources, natural resources, financial resources to a war effort that initially wasn't well liked. It wasn't well affirmed, that's the long and short of it.
Okay. And then in that same vein, Tanja, I'm going to go to you for the next question. What impact did Black chaplains have on the Union Army? So we know that the AME Church, as Terrence mentioned, has an impact on the war effort. So what about AME chaplains specifically? What did they offer? What did they bring to the table?
So one of the things that I imagine that the chaplains brought to the table during that time was that they really provided a clearinghouse for the soldiers to be able to have dialogue about their experiences. The chaplains also served as a beacon of light, and to encourage them, in that time. Because during the Civil War, and what many may not know is that, as soldiers were encouraged to, join the Union Army to advance freedom for Black folk, the conditions, of their involvement in the Civil War was not good. They didn't have, if you think about just that time, just in general, the germ theory of disease had not been created yet. It wasn't proliferated until 1870. So during the Civil War, 1861, you had a lot of the soldiers dying, really due to disease more than to the actual warfare itself. And so the chaplains, provided guidance, they provided encouragement. If I think about in present day, that would be their psychologist, for the soldiers during that time to keep us inspired to keep moving. I also think that they also served, as a way to encourage them to live the Christian life while they were mistreated. And so they helped to teach the soldiers how to read and write, those that didn't know how. And so they just kept the momentum going. Without the chaplains of the AME Church, that war and the persistence of the Black soldiers, I believe, would not have been as strong. So they kept them engaged and they kept them going. They kept them motivated.
Absolutely. Carrie and Reginald, do either of you have any commentary on AME involvement in the Civil War, AME chaplains? Carrie, I'll go to you first.
I'm just ever more so just impressed with the church's involvement and their efforts to recruit and to offer up leadership in that kind of way. It's something that they had forged over a long period of time and knew that it would be of value. So those few AME chaplains who were able to serve, I think, became even more of a representation of the efforts that African Americans had made towards institutional life and leadership development.
To add just a little to that, one of the really important symbolic roles of Black chaplains was there were very few Black officers in the Union Army. And one of the few routes that you had to be an officer was by becoming a chaplain. So having these men with authority meant a great deal psychologically to Black soldiers, just to see a Black person in authority with serving as an officer. Even though they weren't commanding people on the field, they did have the rank. And that was incredibly important. I think Dr. Dickerson did an excellent job in this chapter talking about the backgrounds of the 4 AME chaplains, one of whom I knew David Stevens very little about. And the roles that they played that has already been described. Henry McNeil Turner pledged. He was one of the first chaplains, Black chaplains at all. Of the 14 that existed, 4 of them being AMEs. But Henry McNeil Turner vowed that no man was going to leave his regiment who was not literate. He was going to be a teacher as well as a chaplain. And for men coming in who didn't know how to read, he had literacy drills that he helped his men move forward with. And not only the chaplains, but the chaplains sometimes had ministers who were unordained preachers in their regiments who helped them, who served the role of holding services and doing the kinds of things that Dr. Dandy was talking about. And ministers who were in the area, people who were coming down as missionaries to the South, pardon me, also played a role as sort of assisting the work of chaplains in serving communications between soldiers and their families at home, distributing copies of the Christian Recorder. But these people as officers, as leaders within the Army, in addition to their religious role, had a very symbolic importance. Some of them were, if we get to talk about Henry McNeil Turner and William Henry Hunter, they're just incredible human beings in terms of their force and power and the things they accomplished under great odds.
Okay, so we have 2 questions from the audience, both related to the Civil War. So the first is, was the support for the Civil War related to freedom? I think another way of asking this is, did AMEs have reasons besides, emancipation for joining the Civil War? Did they have other motivations besides fighting for freedom to participate? Terrence, what do you think about that one?
I would, trying to put myself in the context of those in that time, I think it was for freedom. If you look at the involvement of African Americans in the wars, War of 1812, Mexican-American War, it was always, our service was always given under the hope that a better life after, right? And so I can imagine the men and women who were engaged during this time. If we do this, if we go down for this, then on the other side is a better life. I would argue with great caution, but I would still argue it's not a super patriotic. We want to, wrap ourselves in Bessie Ross's flag and make the move, but rather an exchange of services. You have a need. We're willing to fulfill that need, and in exchange for that, we have a better life. Like, we're showing that we're just as American as part of you. That's how I've always understood it. It was never this, we have to preserve the Union. There was no Union for them. They were, even freed blacks. There was no Union for them. We don't often talk about that. But if we do this for the Union, even I would argue, even some of our ancestors for the Confederacy, in exchange for this, can you just raise the boot up just a little bit so we can breathe in how we engage it? I hope that answers the question. I was trying not to offend any veterans out there.
And we have another question related to the Civil War. Can we see that as well? From Walter Henry, who was another previous panelist. Did those who served during the Civil War see their service as a civic duty, a godly mandate, a mixture of the two, or was there another reason they did so? So I will give that to Reg. What do you think about that one?
I would add to what Reverend Thomas said, that I think it's fairly straightforward. The people, the Black people who fought in the Civil War were fighting for freedom. There were other things in addition to that, but they were fighting for freedom. They were fighting to free their brothers and sisters in slavery. There was also the hope that that you would earn the right to citizenship by serving to preserve the Union. But in terms of what made them risk their lives and join the Union Army, prior to the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation, and before Black people could be enlisted in the Army, Henry McNeil Turner saw this in biblical terms. He said Lincoln was Pharaoh, and that the North was larger than the South, had more power than the South, had more money and industrial might than the South. There was no reason that it shouldn't have been able to smack down the South early on. Turner's view was God was not going to let Lincoln win this war until he freed the slaves. And so they saw this war as they could see the hand of God in this. And they saw Lincoln, with all of his flaws, being an instrument of God, whether he wanted to or not. And they saw themselves as God's army. Why religion was so important in the camps of Black soldiers. And when you read it, it almost sounds exaggerated. They couldn't have been that religious. But I think they really believed they were in a crusade, that God had ordained them to end slavery, to have their people become free. So it was in part a duty that they acknowledged. That was part of what they were doing, but they did see it, in the words of the question, did see it as a godly mandate, and more than a mixture of the two, it was primarily the godly mandate for freedom, and secondarily, but not unimportantly, a civic duty.
Okay. So after the Civil War ends, as we know, we head into the period of Reconstruction. And because there is now freedom and the AME Church now has the opportunity to expand throughout the country, which is something that was prohibited to them prior to the Civil War, now you see this rush of AME ministers going out, establishing new churches. And this is actually one of my favorite parts of this chapter, just seeing all the different people who participated in this and what that expansion looked like on the ground. So Tanja, I'm going to direct this next question to you. Who were the clergymen who aided in church expansion during Reconstruction, and in what ways were they diverse? So who are some of the people who participated in this expansion during Reconstruction, and in what ways were they diverse? Can you unmute, Tanja?
Yes. Not only did you ask a good question, you asked a very, it's a detailed question. So, and I may need some help, and I don't mind asking for help if I don't remember the names of all of the people. But what I would say is when you look at the clergy, during that time, and you look at the chaplains during that time, I would say that in terms of the expansion, I think as a leader during that time, you had to have vision.
Yes.
In order to receive that the AME Church and to receive and to understand that the AME Church needed to keep the message going and they needed to keep the momentum going. So while I'm not able to really rattle off the names of all of the ministers of that time,
there are a lot in that chapter, to be fair. There are a lot of them.
There were a lot. I will rely on my colleagues for that. But what I do understand about the question, is that in order to maintain momentum in a time such as this, even though the Civil War had just ended and we're in the Reconstruction era, you still have to look ahead, as to talk about who are the other people that I can impact. How can I impact their lives, and how can I get the message across the waters? And so the diversity of the groups of people during that time, like the BCE group, the British group, it requires to have dialogue from persons, who maybe didn't look like you, or who maybe had different ideology, because you have to have dialogue to be able to expand, right? And you have to be able to encourage people to have to be able to move about and to be able to expand. They have to be encouraged to do so, and they have to know that that the group of people that are having that discussion, you should be able to to agree on certain things.
Okay. And Carrie, do you have anything to add to that? Who were some of these people expanding during Reconstruction, and how were they diverse?
Well, because you said diverse, I'm just going to say Biddy Mason.
Yes.
Drop it.
Right.
So there were they were both genders.
Yeah, you said clergyman, and I'm like, but Biddy Mason is my favorite.
Clergy and lay.
Yeah, so I was very fascinated by the story of Biddy Mason, this enslaved person who goes out west and, saves up her money and, plants a church out there. So that's certainly, more than the expansion in the South, into Indian Territory, into Texas and all the, other areas, Spain and, Henry Highland Garnett and all the others, Sue and all of them who are going on to all these different places. I'm always going to be impressed by, those who, as a church that was Jarena Lee was not she was not acknowledged, and here comes Biddy Mason. Her story is certainly very fascinating to me as someone who is coming up out of slavery and did not have the clout like people like Henry McNeil Turner.
Yeah, so I'm glad you mentioned her, of course. So a lot of these folks, obviously many of them come from backgrounds in which they were enslaved, but not everyone did. Some came from, different regions of the country. Some were former slaves, some were not. Some were well educated, some were not. And so you see this great diversity ethnically and with background. But all these people have the same vision together, that this church is important. This church needs to expand. And this is a church for all of us, whether we have different ethnic backgrounds, whether we are educated, whether we're illiterate, whether we're men, whether we're women. And so that's what I found so inspiring about this part, that all these people have these different backgrounds and yet they're coming together for the same vision. So, Reg, go ahead, Cree.
Yeah, I was going to say that, the vision there, right? The different Pan-Africanism versus, Payne suggesting that, we have to make sure that we're securing, African Americans in the South first before we're expanding. Otherwise, so I found all of that very fascinating in terms of how the geography and reach of this vision as different people from different backgrounds, mixed race people, educated, uneducated, enslaved, formerly free, and so on, are coming to the fore.
Absolutely. And Reg, did you have anything to add with that?
Okay, before the hour is over, I'll learn how to do this. I'll mention three examples of different kinds of people. All of whom are mentioned. What Dr. Dickerson Sr. has done remarkably in one chapter is pulled together a great deal of powerful information in a way that people can get it and understand it and get a sense for what's going on. One of the stories he tells is of Theophilus G. Stewart, who was pastor of Macedonia AME Church in Camden, New Jersey. And he gets a telegram from Bishop Payne one day telling him that the next day he's supposed to be going to South Carolina with the bishop to help organize the AME Church. And the remarkable thing about that is there's no discussion. There's no saying, well, I got stuff to do. I have things to take care of. The next day he was on the boat going down there to fulfill this mission. Richard Harvey Kane, who was one of my favorites, pastor of Bridge Street in Brooklyn, New York, really was, if you read his letters to the Christian Recorder, you get a sense of the excitement about seeing freedom unfold before his eyes, something they'd been praying and hoping for all their lives, and it's happening. And he's in New York. He wants to be down there. He's 40 years old. He's not a young man, but but this is strenuous work. And the first chance he gets to go down in 1865, he goes down. He builds Emmanuel Church. He starts a newspaper. He starts schools. He gets into politics. But he also is organizing churches, facilitating the organizing of churches throughout South Carolina. And there's several times when he just works himself till he just collapses. He is so involved in this. The last and a poignant story, I think, is Bishop Payne himself, who was a free Black in Charleston, had a school. The authorities shut down his school because they thought he was giving Black people inappropriate aspirations. He's crushed, and he goes north. And then in 1865, this man who had fled from Charleston comes back, but he comes back with the authority and dignity of being a bishop of the AME Church, the same city that he left, and organizes and helps facilitate the coming of freedom and schools for the people that he loved, and the community he had once belonged to. So.
Absolutely. Oh no, that's great. That is fantastic. All right. So keeping with the Reconstruction theme, I'm going to go to Terrence now for the next question. So part of what makes Reconstruction so important for Black people is not only that they're finally enjoying their first taste of freedom, but also that they are finally getting a chance to have political power. So you see roughly 2,000 African Americans who are able to hold local, state, and federal office. And within that number, you have many AMEs. So Terrence, what did it mean for Blacks and for the AME Church to have AME ministers holding local, state, and federal offices? What did that mean for them? What did that mean for the church?
It meant they were in the room where it happened. To
I knew you were going to do that.
That's my one per event. In my head. You saw it coming. That's my one per event.
I saw it.
My fiance, she is screaming right now at the screen. That's my one per event. But honestly, that's what it meant. Reconstruction, and I think it's critical that we kind of break Reconstruction into points. At this point, there's still an opportunity to correct this thing And so it means political power. It means engagement. One of my favorite scholars, Harold Cruz, argues not slavery that we get our racial dynamics, is Reconstruction, which the mores and things of American society are kind of created. And so it's important because you have these black folks who were free, who were newly emancipated, who whatever, to now be engaged in a process that since the inception of this country had been locked out for them. I think in terms of AMEs, it's a space of power. It's a position of power. We're now in a place of determining our freedom within this context. And so when you have AMEs or Black people, let's just kind of expand a little bit out Black people, we now can engage in the civil process, right? Not just as voters, not just as passive observers. We're now dictating laws and rules. And so when crazy congressmen propose crazy rule about Black folks got to report somewhere at 8 o'clock, you now have somebody in the room that can say, nope, not doing that. That's crazy. That's ridiculous, and can argue it. And so I think that's kind of the importance of that, right? I think that it also helps facilitate the church growth that we talked about, because now on the other side, whereas prevented through laws, through customs, whatever, we now have people in position of power that can remove those barriers in which it can expand.
Okay. Well, I definitely want to get to the idea of not only expansion within the United States during Reconstruction, but also throughout the diaspora. So, Korea, you know I'm going to you. So can you say something about the AME Church expanding in Africa and the Caribbean? What did that look like during this period? What were the challenges of this kind of expansion?
Certainly, Christina. As I mentioned earlier about enslaved African Americans going up into Canada, settling in a variety of settlements up there, and therefore expanding the AME up into that territory, branching off for political reasons and creating the BME, and then pushing from that to use the BME as a part of the expansion into Bermuda, into other parts of the British Empire. But the AME expansion into the Caribbean and into other parts of the world also came on the back of emigration, right? Or through to Liberia, I think earlier chapters, but as well as this one, might have mentioned Daniel Coker, right? Who went to Liberia and was able to take the AME Church there with him. We looked at the emigration to Haiti and the planting of, the AME Church in Santo Domingo, and then the expansion into Jamaica and Barbados and elsewhere into the world. And that is, as Dr. Dickerson has clearly articulated in this book about the emancipationist ethos of the church, that expansion is a part of that, because the church is looking at what is going on in these kinds of spaces. They're very well aware of the politics that Black grapevine is circulating through the exchange of information in the different newspapers. And so it's facilitating the movement of information, and also the movement of the church as an institutional body into these spaces. And so there, with this expansion, you see the reach of the church grow into all these different districts and into all these different conferences, and so the AME Church is able to acquire power. I was very interested in terms of the language of taking territory. I don't think that was the particular the fight between the CMEs and the BMEs and the AMEs. And the AMEs, like, we have to take the territory, right? So I found all of that fascinating, as the expansion being a part of that whole Black nationalist, Pan-Africanist motif of the church and going where all Black people exist, there we must exist as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's really exactly it. The AME Church basically says, if there's a Black person there, we're going. And that has always been the vision of the AME Church from the very beginning, that it was never intended to be something that was just in Philadelphia, just in New York, just in even South Carolina. It was always meant to be for the African diaspora and for any oppressed people of color anywhere in the world. Okay, so we're going to move to question 15, and I want to go to Tanja first for this. So we see in this chapter, and also it's emphasized in Dr. Hildebrand's book, The Times Are Strange and Stirring, that you have these different Black Methodist denominations, each with their own rich histories. You have the AME Church, the AME Zion Church, the CME Church. Well, during the time period discussed in this chapter, there is great debate among Methodists. Should the AME Church and should the AME Zion Church merge together? Would we be stronger together, or are we too different? So my question to you is, would it have been beneficial for the AME Church to merge with the AME Zion Church?
To answer that question, I would say no. I think that this is my personal belief. I don't think you can have two masters here. I think while the ideology was very similar, I think at some point, one denomination, would need to take the lead. And I believe the AME Church did take that lead. They were bold enough, to take that lead. And I think you also have to look at the structure of our AME Church. And from its inception, the bishophood was the lead of our church. And so if you have bishops that are in charge, the bishops can carry the vision, and the vision can be consistent, as new bishops are elected, right? And so I think, in terms of the bishophood and the AME Church, I strongly believe that you just have to have, I guess, one leading denomination. We had the courage. We kept the momentum going, as we had the vision to move to other territories. And I think we've been consistent with that. So that's my personal belief as I read this story.
And I'm going to kick that to Reg. Any thoughts on that? Should they have merged? Would we have been stronger together as one united denomination, or was it just never going to work? What do you think?
Christina, I was perfectly happy to rest with Dr. Dandy's answer. I think you're trying to provoke something here.
I'm asking a question.
but I would underscore that Henry McNeil Turner, who was as committed to the larger vision as anybody possibly could be, was a great admirer and saw himself as a co-worker with James Walker Hood of the AME Zion Church. And at times when they were going through the South, pardon me, he thought it was confusing to people coming out of slavery to try to make the distinction between AME and AME Zion. What difference does it make to them? So at some point, Turner thought, this is confusing and it's wasteful and it's pointless. Why don't we unite? Taking on the similar task that we have. And while there are differences, there aren't differences that can't be worked out. And Dr. Dickerson, I think, very succinctly explained that in 1864, there was an effort toward that end, and it failed largely because the African Methodist Episcopal Church chose not to follow through on it. And there can be a case made for, there's no reason to do that. But if we chose to do this, it could be done. If lay people decided to, lay organizations had joint conferences and projects, if ministers decided they were going to exchange pulpits with the AME Zion ministers, This could be done over time if we thought it was important, but we may not. Of course, one of the real problems here is that somebody's going to have to give up some bishops, and that's kind of hard.
Well, I'm going to go to Cree and then Terrence on that question.
I can only echo what Dr. Hildebrand was saying, as Dr. Dickerson noted in the text, that even in their own efforts as AMEs to expand the church and to grow the numbers, as you know, he denoted that the numbers were getting close and the AMEs were trying to grow, and people were like, "Well, I thought I was going to the AME church. Oh, I'm Zion. I joined the Zionists. I thought it was the same thing." You know, that speaks to so many of the issues that we have, within the Black community today. Right? It's a microcosm. What was going on with these churches, a microcosm of these larger issues that we have, and what you see out here in the streets, whether it's with the basketball players, like, do we want to strike? Do we play? Do we not play? Right? And all having to, do we get on one accord? Right? And are we stronger as a fist? Or should we go and, our separate ways and have our own separate ideas that we implement into policies and into institutions? So the AMEs cut their nose off to spite their face with that, I felt.
Trying to figure out a nice way to land this plane. It should have happened then, and it should happen now. And I think the term, Dr. Hildebrand said it best, wasteful, it's redundant. You have 3 Black denominations who then should have done it. And now in a context of shrinking denominations, shrinking resources, this should be done now. And the only reason that it ain't done now is because folks don't want to give up their positions of privilege. Full stop. Folks don't want to share whatever perceived power, resources, et cetera, they have. Imagine, if you will, a world where all 3 of these came together. And I'm going to be honest, it should come under the AME banner. But imagine a world that it came under what we could do, right? The power we possess. The differences are there, yes. But are they like that so much that we need 3 separate entities? And I'm talking CME, AME, Zion, or these are matters of getting into a room and parsing them out. I think that I love that, Dr. Banton. It was a moment to cut off your nose to spite your face. And we are now, for me, these kind of decisions, when I read about them historically, I look at the impact 100 years out. And so 150 years out. So 100 years out now, we have 3, I know AME ain't supposed to say it, but we got 3 struggling denominations trying to chart its way through the 21st century, when we could have just came together as a fist. And maybe this is my Chicago side coming out. This is the 1% of me that's not a Black nationalist. But I mean, if Italian gangsters can get into a room in the 1920s and create the commission, then there's no way God-centered people in 2021 cannot come together and create a super denomination.
A super denomination. I like it. Absolutely. Thank you for that comment, Clarissa. All right, so finally, I'm going to just go around and ask each of you to respond to what should we as AMEs take away from this chapter? What in general should we learn from this? What should we take away as AMEs? So I'm going to start with Tanja.
I think what we should take away from this chapter is understanding that we as Black people, we demonstrated then back in the 1800s that we were a strong people, and that if we collectively come together, we can accomplish anything. And I also think that we should take from this chapter examples of how we can go about affecting change by being tenacious, by being a part of the political process, and not just voting in the presidential election, but also understanding that there is a political process that starts long before you vote for a president, and that you have to be engaged in the earlier times. And so that's to me, what I took away from this chapter. And I think that's one of the things that all of us, including AMEs, can take away from this chapter.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Terrence, your thoughts. What should we take away from this chapter?
A lot. One, that there is no such thing as a non-political pastor or non-political minister. We're political from appointments to what goes in the Christian recorder to who sits where. And so most certainly this chapter outlines that there's a place at the table. The gospel message is political. It is political. I think, too, that God does show up and to be a preacher in ways we cannot imagine. We have a newly emancipated people. We have free people who were with limited rights, and they came together and they built something that sustained Black society, right? I mean, HBCUs come out of this, political come out of this. We connected with our brothers and sisters across the border to grow our Zion. And third, it takes imagination. Like, these folks were imaginative, creative, and they were not stuck in tradition. I think Dr. Hildebrand talked about Payne, how he came back. He didn't let that stop him. And so one of my favorite movies says the past is prologue. And so right about now, we should be looking to that to inspire us in this midst of COVID, where there's a time this would have been an in-person panel with 200 people. Now we're reaching thousands of folks. Like, take God out of the box. Slavery was a box, but yet they thought outside of the box. So then why aren't we doing that in 2021 as AMEs, as ministers? And the last point is this church is radical. I'm sure the later chapters does talk about what happened. I'm not going to spoil it, but we got to get that radical fire back. Like, this mealy conservative neoliberalism that we're operating in this was hurting our church right now. This was a church of liberation, freedom on both here and now, and it pushed towards that. And so I think that's what I took from this chapter, in a nutshell.
Wonderful. So then we'll go to Kari and then Reg.
What I'd like for people, and certainly what I took from this chapter, is that wherever Black people are unfree, we should be concerned. And that none of us are free until all of us are free. That's what I got from this chapter by virtue of looking at the AME's action in terms of expanding the church into areas as people, with its emancipationist ethos, and as people are coming out of slavery, to help in that development, to help to get people on their feet, right? That wherever there are Black people who are experiencing oppression, that we have to be concerned, and we have to put our power, our resources, our voices behind that, right? Or build up organizational forces to confront that, is certainly what I think was the overwhelming idea that kind of came through for me in this chapter.
I'm still trying to come to terms with Reverend Thomas's suggestion that the AME Church might benefit from following the model and the example of the mafia and getting together, as some people would say we're doing that too much already, but
it was an analogy. It was an analogy and an example. You suggested we're the mafia.
Reverend Duck, you're trying to clean it up now. I heard.
Clean it up.
We heard you. First, I'd like to say this has come up last week as well as this week, and she showed remarkable restraint. The leading scholar on women carrying the message of the AME Church to the West and with Indians, we didn't get to that question, is Dr. Christina Dickerson Cousin, and she'll be having a book coming out on this before long that will be the standard and open up our eyes on many of the things that Dr. Banton was talking about, really important work. I have 3 points, if I can get them out, about takeaways. One, anyone who wants to have a deeper and fuller understanding of what it means to belong to a connectional church with the Black Atlantic perspective that Dr. Dickerson writes about so well. If you are a preacher or a lay person and want to know what the responsibilities and obligation and the vision should be when you become an AME, you need to read this book and discuss this book.
Yes.
If you're not an AME and you want to understand African American history and particularly the history of the Black church, this is a book that you have to have under your belt. There's no way to get around it. After this book has been published, this sets a standard in terms of the issues that it discusses and the quality and the rigor with which it discusses them. If you are interested in African American history, you need to read and study this book. And from this chapter, what I take away from this is we're in a denomination that's entering its 3rd century. And if you want to get a sense of a moment when being an African Methodist meant literally putting your life on the line, when you are willing, a small church, largely in the Northeast, assumes that it has the power and the mission to embrace nearly 4 million people coming out of slavery who had nothing but their faith. And they build schools and they build churches, the landmarks that we still acknowledge, the churches, St. John's and Big Bethel and the rest. These are things that these people who, at a time of great turmoil and violence, at a time when being an AME instead of a CME could mean that you got killed, put everything they had on the line, being African Methodist, and saying that had to mean something to people who are trying to establish themselves as free people and as God's people. I see this chapter as covering the heroic moment in the history of the AME. There are other great significant moments, and we're going to one next week, but there is not a moment of greater drama and sacrifice and commitment and courage than people going south after the Civil War.
Ooh. I could talk to, thanks, Mom. I could listen to the 4 of you all day long. This was amazing. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Carrie Banton. Her book, More Auspicious Shores, Barbadian Migration to Liberia, Blackness and the Making of an African Republic, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2019 and is available for purchase on Amazon. So thank you again for joining us, Carrie, my fellow Commodore. Thank you, Dr. Reginald Hildebrand. If you're interested in learning more about the material in Chapter 3, purchase Dr. Hildebrand's book, The Times Were Strange and Stirring, Methodist Preachers and the Crisis of Emancipation. So when we were talking about the differences between AME, AME Zion, and CME, this book really outlines this in a very clear way. So you can dig deeper into that if you have interest in that way.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tanja Dandy. You can donate to the Tennessee School for the Blind at the website mentioned here, friendsoftsb.org. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you, Reverend Terrence Thomas. Please join Bethel AME Church in Champaign, Illinois, for Day 3 of their Transformative Faith Virtual Women's Retreat, featuring Stephanie Posey and Karen Sims. So thank you again so much, panelists, for joining us and giving us this riveting discussion. Thank you, everyone in the audience. Thank you, everyone who watched, everyone who commented or asked a question. Please join us here next week, same bat time, same bat channel, with another group of fantastic panelists. We'll be discussing Chapter 4. Thank you again. Bye-bye.